Good morning, everybody. I'm Robert Scheer, and this is your 6 AM Wake Up. Okay, I'm titling this session, Who Knows It's a Bad Thing? When I first got into recovery 21 years ago, I started to go to meetings, and I met a guy named David C. At the time, David C. maybe had 3 or 4 years clean. I didn't know him well, but I saw him at a lot of meetings, and at the time I thought he had a great message. Over the next few months, maybe a year or two, I could see that David's message was getting sour. He was getting a little bit bitter and angry, and I realized that the reason was he was suffering from hepatitis C, and it was getting increasingly worse. David started to blame God and his circumstances for his hepatitis C. If you don't know, hepatitis C sometimes can lay dormant for a number of years. And so David was an intravenous drug user, got clean, but after getting clean, the symptoms of the hepatitis C became more and more pronounced. In essence, he was dying of liver failure. And at the time, and I don't know if it's still the case, David was not a candidate for a liver transplant because he was a former drug user and basically, to put it bluntly, not a good bet. Why waste a liver on somebody that could easily relapse? And so it wasn't worth giving him a liver. So David was very upset. He felt he'd done all the right things, changed his life, turned it around, and he was basically saying, why me, God? Why, after all this stuff I've been through, am I going to die from the very same things that I fought so hard to recover from, and that's my drug use? And it was in this period that David suffered another major setback. He was diagnosed with a rare blood cancer. I don't really know the details, and I'm going to interrupt now and say that some of what I'm describing here I know firsthand, and some of it is hearsay, and some of it is probably hearsay to amplify the story, but all of it is essentially correct. So David had this rare blood disease, and he was really fit to be tied, as one could imagine. He had liver failure, and he was dying of that, and now he had a fatal blood disorder. And he really had reached a point where he was like saying, to heck with it, I might as well use. I'm going to die anyway. Why do I keep going to meetings, practicing these principles? It hasn't worked. Of course, he forgot all of the grace and all of the wonderful things that he'd gotten in recovery and was really just blaming his circumstances on God. And it was at that point that David learned of a program at NIH, a clinical trial that they were launching to treat this rare blood disorder. And somebody convinced David to look into it, and he did. And he was a good candidate for the trial, and it was a long-term longitudinal trial. And so the NIH arranged for David to get a new liver. Because they needed him to live for several years to see the results of this longitudinal trial. And lo and behold, the trial was very effective. And so as a result of having the rare blood cancer, he no longer had hepatitis C, he had a new liver, and he no longer had the rare blood cancer. That was in remission. And so for the rest of David's life, and I saw him for many years after and at many meetings, he would always repeat the refrain, the mantra, who knows it's a bad thing? And the point, in case it's lost on you, is, I think, fairly obvious. You think something's really horrible. In his case, the blood disorder, or maybe even the hep C. But you really don't know the plan. You don't know what God has in store for you or what life has in store for you. And so when you think you've lost your job, and there couldn't be anything worse than that, your relationship has gone south, and you can't understand what happened and how you're going to recover from that. you yourself have some type of chronic condition, or perhaps worst of all, someone you love in your life has passed away, just remember those words David used to say, "Who knows it's a bad thing?" Thanks for listening to my thoughts for the day.